Last week, President Donald Trump announced an executive order.
In a few moments, I will sign an executive order
to dismantle the Federal Department of Education.
to begin eliminating the Federal Department of Education.
And I'm sure what's on the mind of school administrators, teachers, parents, and students around the country is, what now? Regardless of your political orientation or whether you're happy about what Trump is doing, what we really want to talk about is how this decision actually changes the landscape and the environment that these educators are working in, and how they can start to think about responding to this new change. And I think what we're really thinking about what this decision actually has impact on is not really fundamentally how these schools work. Like, it could not mean any real change in terms of how these schools operate, but I think the big meaningful change here is more freedom for these schools, and a catalyst for change. Like, the public is now very much aware that there is something happening in education.
I think this shows, at least from Trump's perspective, that something in the education system needs to change.
We're not doing well with the world of education in this country, and we haven't for a long time.
That it has not been working. And it's true. I mean, we've spent so much money on education, and yet compared to Finland, we're not doing very well.
The United States spends more money on education by far than any other country, but yet we rank near the bottom of the list in terms of success.
Like, so many kids don't know how to read and can't write very well.
70% of 8th graders are not proficient in either reading or in math. 40% of 4th graders lack even basic reading skills.
Before, what we were doing with Weequal School and Weequal App is we were focusing on alternative education in terms of helping
those who were exiting the system. And the reason why wasn't because we were like, oh, we're going to do this alternative education thing. Like, we were open to everybody. The problem is that the public schools were just kind of in this giant bureaucracy that there was no really mechanism for change, and there was no catalyst for change. Nobody was really taking that initiative because it was just so hard, and so many teachers had become exacerbated to the point that they were like, this isn't going to change. I'm going to do what I can for these kids with what I have. But now I think it's a really great thing that people are aware of these issues and now are thinking about how can we respond, because Democrats and those on the other side of the aisle, like, they can see that there's a lot of things wrong with our public education system. It's almost an objective fact at this point that we are not doing well. And so really what this is allowing for is more freedom as to how we respond to that. And we kind of wanted to talk about a little bit of our background and journey with this, because initially when we first started Weequal School during the pandemic, we were at first, the people who were joining were our friends from public school. Right?
Well, they didn't really have anywhere else to go.
Exactly. And we were kind of the only place that was open, and it was free. We just wanted to share projects with our friends and have fun. And so a lot of what we were doing there was actually a really great environment because, well, one, these kids were used to a public school environment where their interests weren't taken into account, where they didn't have any freedom and flexibility. So they were feeling, just really free to explore their interests and having a lot of motivation, because in comparison, it was like way more, something that they were excited about. And also one thing that we noticed about kind of moving into the alternative education space was, what is the selection bias of the people who are, exiting the system? Right?
Because you're going to be extreme in some way if you decide not to use the free education solutions that have been brought to you.
Right. Yeah. For us, we were just extremely interested in education and very passionate about this subject.
And that's some people. Granted.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've met some amazing people in the alternative education space, and some, and those families that are homeschooled, many of them we're working with and are, part of our community. And so we're very grateful for that. But one thing that we did notice was that kind of if you exit a system of coordination and cooperation, you need to find other kinds of mechanisms to bring what that sort of system creates. And in order to do that on your own, you have to take so much initiative. You have to be very, very proactive about bringing that to your family and to your children.
You need to be aware that it's not just going to spawn out of nowhere. Like, if you take your kids out of school, who are they going to engage with now? Right. It's not going to be their public school friends because they're still in school. Yeah. And you're going to have to build a strong community of people who can keep you in check.
Yeah, and so that's something that we did notice. One story that maybe you can kind of elaborate on what was happening is, like, we were going to the basketball court at the community center every week, and like we were meeting a lot of different people there. And when we played with the public,
we invited a bunch of homeschoolers to come.
Yeah, before we had just kind of been playing with the kids there, which had been mostly from public school. And when we played with the public school kids, they were very used to coordinating in groups and kind of like, you know, engaging with other sorts of kids. And so we had a great time. Everything was, you know, went very smoothly.
But so, like, with the public school kids, they're used to operating within a system, which is really important. And they're also used to sometimes doing things and dealing with things that they don't want to do, and they don't like. But that's just a fact of life, you know. And so, in terms of when you have a structure like a game or something that's really clear and objective, public school kids, they do really well, because that's the environment that they're used to. But when we were engaging with the homeschoolers, a lot of them had been out of that system for so long that they just didn't know how to work in that system. And
well, not even with it's just with other people and being able to coordinate in something bigger than yourself. And one example was that, like, one of the kids just like didn't have any experience with basketball, and so they threw the ball and it hit the net. It didn't go in, hit the net. And so she was like, you know, how about we count that as a point? And
that was the mom.
That was one of the moms, and we were like, that's not how that works.
Yeah, you know, that's just like, not how basketball works.
And so you know, after the game, we were gonna shake hands with, you know, the other team, and then one of the kids just like refused to shake the hands, and then like the parent was not helping us in terms of encouraging that and saying, like, you know, you got to be a good sport.
Well, I think the parent, I think the parents who come out of public school, it can be motivated by wanting to protect your child. But again, we've already seen that you know, you have to work really hard to have a community, and to have a feedback mechanism, because if you're not getting grades, and a lot of the, you know, the assessment, at least in Virginia, is very, very lax for these homeschoolers in terms of what is actually the legal requirement of what you need to prove to the state. You know, you can get homeschool evaluators, but the quality of the evaluators can vary. And when it comes to the test, you can take an online test that, you know, the parent could take for you and they would never know. And so when it comes to the quality of those actual standards, to give you a tether to reality, and it's not that these grades are reality, it's that it's somebody else there. You know, because you can't know reality by yourself. That's certain. And so at least if you have other people there around you, then that can be really important. One thing about the flip side of this, for when it comes to the public school kids, is that they don't know how to think for themselves. They are dependent on that structured environment. They can do well in those when it comes to coordinating, when they have very, very clear goals, when it comes to like a game. But when we were engaging with a lot of public school students early on during the pandemic, they didn't know how to have their own ideas. They didn't know how to take initiative in uncertain environments, and that was kind of what that environment created, was an artificial form of certainty and form of feedback that wasn't necessarily accurate. Yeah, so it's two different kinds of isolation here. It's with the homeschoolers, no expectations are imposed, especially with like this idea of unschooling.
Well, the expectations are imposed by the parents, but it's also really easy for that to degrade over time. Like, you know, the parent can come in very stringent, like, here's what we're going to do. We're going to wake up at this time. We're going to create structure for ourselves. But over time, as if the parent decides, like, you know, this isn't necessary, like, the kid's not going to fight back and be like, no, but we should have a bedtime, you know. It's like, you know, it's kind of the parent is there to enforce all of that by themselves. And so it's really easy for that to kind of start to erode over time if you aren't really disciplined. And that's what we really saw was lacking in the alternative education space. The biggest thing that we saw was a lack of discipline. That's not to say that that applies to everybody. It's that it's so hard to create that structure and expectations for yourself. Yeah. You know, like to do that requires so much initiative, and you're constantly fighting against, you know, all the things that might be dragging you away from that.
I mean, it's natural to want to just not want to see your kid feel heard, and like, and not like with the basketball. You don't want to see your kid like not scoring any points, right, and just like losing at basketball. Like, that's painful. Yeah. But you need to have those structures because sometimes you need to go through that. But it's really hard to keep that on yourself if you're the only one who's enforcing that.
Yeah, and so that's something that I think the reason why we kind of went on this kind of mini tangent here is because a lot of what we were seeing when it comes to what was our goal. Our goal is that we saw huge flaws in the way that we were approaching education and in the way we were framing what the goal of education even was in the first place. And we were exploring solutions primarily for ourselves. We were thinking, you know, how can we get the best education, and realizing how we could apply that to other people. And, you know, as I was saying, we're open to everybody. You know, we're happy to take public school kids or those in the alternative space. But prior to, you know, the decimation of the Department of Education, you know, it was just really hard for us to try to actually impact any real change into the public school environment. And so we were very focused on alternative education as kind of, you know, the group of people who are looking for those solutions, and they have a lot of great ideas. You know, there are some great people in that space, and there's a lot of, you know, great intentions, but what we saw was that without the discipline, you cannot execute on those ideas in a way that actually helps the kids that need it. And that's what we found was really difficult in working in that space. And now we're looking at this new change and thinking, here is the opportunity that we have to actually impact the most change and to get what we really wanted in the first place, which is how can we actually help these kids be prepared for the real world? Not an environment where they're told what to do every second of every day, not an environment when they're relying on a teacher to be an arbiter of truth to tell them, oh yeah, you're doing good because you got an A, or no, you did bad because you got an F. You know, that's not how the real world works. And it's not, and when it comes to the alternative education environment, not having any sorts of expectations imposed on you is also not how the real world works. And so what we're really looking at is how can you actually bring that real world understanding into education. And what we're seeing is a huge opportunity here for the public schools because the teachers aren't happy. They know that there's something wrong, and they don't have the freedom to actually try to implement their ideas and to try to, you know, do better. And now I think that that's changing in a way that's incredible. And whether you like how it's being done or not, like, this is basically what we have is more freedom where the funding isn't tied to grades. I think that's a big part of what the problem was, is that everything was centered around grades, with the whole like No Child Left Behind. It was about like, we're going to try to help everybody, but the metric was grades. And I think that was the fundamental flaw, is that we were so focused on that we couldn't actually allow for, you know, teachers to experiment, because what if it sacrifices on the grades and then we lose out on funding, or then we have those problems.
Everyone agreed that we should have more projects and more independence, but it was always under like the assumption that, okay, but it can't inhibit the grades.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, the incentives were how your students are doing in those standardized tests is going to impact the funding. And so now, as that is kind of being removed, what you ultimately have is the freedom to decide for yourself what is the goal of education. Because with the federal department being removed, that on high dictation of the goal of education is better grades is not there. And so what that really means is that we can think for ourselves, what do our children actually need? Is it more knowledge when we have access to the internet 24/7 and access to these AI LLMs that can tell us, an answer to any question that we need to know about objective facts? Is that what we really need, is to cram more knowledge in our heads? Or is it really, how can we actually, create solutions, be creative problem solvers, and learn how to innovate in this digital world? And that's what we really think these kids need to learn how to do. And it's great that you have this foundation of a system where these kids are already there, right? So it's like, we already have this baseline. We can only go up from there, in our opinion, and I think that that's what we're really looking at in terms of how we can actually, help these schools to reevaluate how they're doing things and to actually, reform how these systems are being put into place, because we know that these teachers aren't happy, the students aren't happy, and it's not even working towards the goal that they set, which is grades. Like the grades aren't even doing well.
I think that this change should mean a lot of hope for school administrators and parents and families, because this freedom just means more upside potential for the students. And I think that's what we are coming in to help with, because we have done a lot of work around project-based learning and how to actually implement that in the students' lives, in a way that's really feasible and helpful, and reflective of the real world.